Hey there, this is Jess from Make and Do Crew, and this is a very special video tutorial because it is just for kids. Today, I've partnered with Lion Brand to show you how to use off-the-hook yarn to learn how to finger knit. So all you need to get started is one ball of this Lion Brand off-the-hook finger knitting yarn. And you can see it has these loops in it because that's what we're going to thread together to make our cowl. So you don't need any needles or hooks or anything like that, just a ball of this yarn and your two hands. If you'd like to see more pictures of this project or read some written instructions, you can find the free pattern on my blog, which is called makeanddocrew.com, and I'll put a link to it right below this video. So to get started with our cowl, we're going to find the end of our yarn, which is just wrapped up somewhere in your yarn ball. And unless it has a pretty long tail, we're going to snip a couple of these loops so that we make the tail longer for weaving in at the end. So the way we snip the loops is they're actually sewn together with a little thread down there. So we want to carefully cut right in between the loop at the bottom to get rid of the loop and make a yarn tail. So I'm going to cut 2 here. That's kind of good if you're not sure if you have a long tail or not. You can just cut 2 and that'll make your tail long enough to get started. So I've gone ahead and counted 15 loops here. So I've got 1, 2, 3, all the way to 15, and then I put a paper clip here. And the paper clip is going to show me which part of this is my cowl, this is the beginning of it here, and then everything on the other side we're going to call our working yarn. So that's connected to the ball that you can't see off the camera. And the working yarn just means that we're going to use it to work into these other loops to make a nice tall rectangle to fold into our cowl. Now, something that's important to know is that if you're right-handed or left-handed, you're going to make this exactly the same. So I want you to put the tail of your yarn over here on your left-hand side and your paper clip over here on your right-hand side. And there should be 15 loops between the tail and the paper clip. So once you have that set up, you can move your working yarn, which is the one that's connected to the ball, and you can just kind of lay it out up above the loops that you're going to work first. And now we finally get to learn how to finger knit. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of put all my loops facing up and get them organized a little bit. So that just means I'm pointing them all away from me and I'm trying to make sure that they don't have any twists in them. Because one of our first rules of finger knitting is that if it's twisted, we want to untwist it before we knit that stitch. So I'm going to start over here on the right hand side, and this is where everyone's going to start, even if you're left-handed. And I'm going to take my first loop that's on this side of the paper clip and stick my fingers through it like this. My kids and I like to call this putting your chompers through the loop. So I'm going to stick my chompers through and I'm going to grab the first loop that's on the other side of my paper clip. So once my chompers are through, I can grab that first loop and pull it through the bottom loop. And we just worked our first finger knitting stitch. So this first row is the trickiest one that we'll have, and then it gets much easier when everything is set up. So let's try that again. This one's a little twisted, so I'm going to figure out how to lay it flat. It's going to lay like this. Then I'm going to stick my fingers through like this so they're ready to grab. And I'm going to grab the next loop of the working yarn. When I grab that, I can pull it through like this. And it really helps if you kind of pull it away from you. That's what's going to help all the loops stay put until you come back to knit them again. So let's take a look at that a little closer up. I'm going to grab my next loop that's at the bottom here. I'm going to poke my fingers through, and then I'm going to grab the next loop that's in line on my working yarn and pull it up and away from me. So you can see here that we're making a row. These are all of our knit stitches that are lining up, and we're just going to continue in that same way going all the way across until we get to our tail. So I'm going to grab this one, pull my fingers through, and then get my next loop of yarn and pull it up and away from me. And I'm going to poke my fingers through like this and grab the next loop and pull it away from me. So let's keep going like that. You can go as slowly as you need to get this first row done. We're going to work all the way over to our tail. And once we've made it to the end of our row here, we're going to check for a couple things. One thing we're going to check for is, do any of our stitches look twisted? And I can see here, this one of mine got a little twisted. You can see it doesn't lay as flat as the other ones. So I'm just going to pull it out, twist it around so it's untwisted, and then pull this loop through. So that's the cool thing about finger knitting, is you can just kind of make a change and fix it even if you find a mistake. Then I see another one that's twisted here, so I'm just going to turn it around and pull it through. And next I'm just going to kind of pull all my loops toward the sky. That's what helps get everything tightened down and get the next row ready to work. And then the one last thing I'm going to check for, and it's a good idea to do this after you work each row because you'll catch mistakes quicker, which is I'm just going to turn it over and say, did I forget to work any loops here? Do I see any that are hanging off that got left behind? And the answer here is no, we got them all. So we can move on to the next row. So I'm going to flip this over. We're always going to have this side of the project looking at us while we work. So I'm going to keep my tail over here on the left. It's going to stay over there. And now I'm going to move my working yarn in the opposite direction. So it's going to go across right here so it's ready to be worked in these loops. And we're going to start over here next to the working yarn, and the first loop that's on the bottom, I'm going to stick my fingers through and then grab the first loop of working yarn. Just like we did before, I'm going to check and make sure these stitches aren't twisted before I knit them. So this one looks good. I'm going to stick my fingers through it and grab the next loop of working yarn. This one looks a little twisted, so I'm going to untwist it and stick my fingers through and grab my next loop of working yarn and pull it through. So you can see we're just going to do the same thing we did before. It's a little easier now because everything isn't so wiggly, but I'm going to finger knit each of these stitches until we get back over here to the other side. Okay, so now I've finished the second row here, and you can see I got my last stitch worked here. I pulled it up, and now we've got our working yarn over here again on the right side. So I'm going to pull all my loops up, check to see if any of them look twisted, which they don't this time. And I'm going to flip it over, see if I missed any loops, which it looks like we didn't, so we're going to turn this over. And now we basically know the knitting stitch. So you're pretty much ready to keep going on your cowl. I'll just start this row with you one more time so we can make sure we have the hang of it. So I moved my working yarn this way because I'm going to start over here where it's attached, and I'm going to poke my fingers through the very first stitch of my row that's already been worked, and I'm going to grab my first loop of working yarn. And again, I'm going to take the next stitch that's next to it, poke my fingers through, and grab the next stitch of working yarn. So a couple things that we're trying not to do here are to skip any loops in our working yarn. So when we turn our work over and I say, yep or nope, we didn't miss any loops, what I'm talking about is that if we forgot to work this loop and then instead just skipped it and worked the next loop, and the next loop, then when we turned this over, especially after a couple of rows, we might see that there is this stray loop that's left behind, and it's probably going to kind of look like it's hanging out like that. And that's when we know we've made a mistake. So you can go back and just take out the loops right after that one. Make sure you pick up that loop that needed to be worked, and then you can keep going across your row. So as we get to the end of a row, I want to show you one other mistake that's really easy to make when you're finger knitting, and that is to forget to work the very last stitch of the row. So you can see this is one of these loops that should be worked next in our row, but because it's at the end of the row, it sometimes hangs down and it can get kind of lost, especially if you're maybe sitting on the couch and this is on your lap, and it can get hidden, and then you work a lot more rows back and forth, and then you come back and realize, oh man, this little guy was tucked under here and it didn't get worked. And that can make this part of your scarf unravel. So at the end of each row, we want to make sure that we get the very last stitch, which is right here, and I'm gonna pull my last loop through, and then the edge should look like this. And you can see there's no more stitches left to work. So that's when we know we want to work back in the other direction. So now we're going to just keep working back and forth like this, and our project is going to get taller and taller and taller until we have a really long, skinny rectangle. And when you run out of yarn, it's going to be time to seam it up, which means we're going to sew it together into a loop, and that's what's going to fit around your head in a cowl. So why don't you go ahead and work all the rest of your rows, and I will too, and I'll meet you back here to show you how to seam it together. Okay, so we've made it all the way to our end of our yarn here. This is all that's left of my working yarn, one little loop. And you might have more loops left on your working yarn depending on just the number of loops that were in your ball. So that varies a little. It's a little different in every ball. So you might have like 7 loops at the end or 14 loops at the end. As soon as you get to 14 or fewer loops though, you're gonna wanna stop because you won't have enough to do the whole row of 15 stitches. So once you stop, you're going to want to have a couple loops left here. I only have one, but that is okay because I have this long tail here. So what I'm going to do is cut this loop just like we did before. If you have more than one loop, you could cut 2 of your loops and then cut your yarn off, because this is going to be our tail that we weave in at the end. But the total number of rows I end up working is 30. So the way I'm counting that is I go way back to the beginning of our rectangle, and I count like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So my ball of yarn allowed me to make 30 rows. And yours might be a little bit different. As long as you end up with like 26 or 27 rows, it'll be totally fine and it'll fit over your head. And if you're a grown-up, 30 rows is a really good size to fit over your head. But as long as you just work all the yarn in your ball, you'll be just fine with your size. So once we've worked our last row, we're gonna fold our rectangle in half and seam it. So to do that, I'm laying my rectangle down with the right side, which is the side we've been looking at the whole time, facing up. It's what I can see. And then I'm gonna fold the edges in like this. And you can see this is starting to be the big loop shape of a cowl. So once it's folded like this, we're gonna line up the loops of our first row with the loops of our last row. And then we're gonna thread them together. So I'm gonna take the loop of my last row and put it through the loop of my first row and then pull it up. So these are a little bit hard to see because it's just yarn scrunched together. But here I'm looking through the first 2 pieces of yarn is my first loop. Then the next 2 pieces of yarn is my second loop. So I'm going to take my second loop from the last row and pull it up right through that second loop of the first row. Let's try that again. Here is my third loop of the first row. So I'm going to grab this third loop, stick it through there, and pull it up. You can see it's kind of tight in here, so it's a little bit tricky to see, but as long as you just go one after another, you should end up with the same number of stitches over here as over here. If you made a mistake somewhere and you have more loops over here than you do over here or something, just end up sticking 2 loops through one hole. It'll be just fine. And if you're using a yarn that's only one solid color like this is, I've found it can be kind of tricky to see where your loops are and then what's the space between a loop. So one thing that has been helpful to me once I get going is to know that once I know that it's in a loop, because I could see like right here that I found a loop there, that then I need to skip 2 strands of yarn and stick it in the next spot. So I wouldn't stick it right here because that's a space between a stitch. But if I skipped 2, so we've got 1, 2, then that puts me in another loop and I can pull the next stitch through. So that's just a way, if I count 2, that's almost easier than being able to see where the hole in the loop is, because everything's kind of scrunched together in this little space. So I'm going to skip 1, 2 and grab my next one. So that's just an easier way to get through, and we're going to carry on like this to the end of the row. And now that we've made it to the end of the row and everything is looped together, we're ready to do our final seam here so that nothing comes unraveled. And if you remember, this is the string at the very end that was our last stitches that we worked. And then we cut this one to make it a little longer tail. So we're gonna start on the opposite direction from that. So for me, it's over here on the right. So I'm gonna start with my loops over here. If your tail is over here, and don't get it confused with your beginning tail, so I'm going to tuck that in here, but if your finishing tail is over here, then you'll start with your loops on the right side. So either way, I'll show you how it goes. You're going to start with the first loop, and the first loop is going to gobble up the second loop. So I'm putting the second loop into the first loop and pulling the second loop through. So now the first loop is fastened off and it can't unravel and we don't have to worry about it anymore. And now we're going to take our second loop and it's going to gobble up our third loop. So I'm going to put my fingers through there and grab it and then pull that third loop through. So now our second loop is all finished off as well. And now we're going to take our third loop and it's going to gobble up the fourth loop and pull it through. And as you can see, we're going to do this across, and this looks like a little caterpillar that's going to crawl all the way across our cowl until we get to this tail over here. So I'm going to take this loop and put my next loop through. They're kind of like leapfrogging each other. I'm going to take this one, put this one through, take this one, put this one through. And we're going to keep going like that until we get to the end of the row, and then I'll show you what to do to finish your cowl off. So now we'll pull our final loop right through here, and then we're left with one loop here and one tail here. So we're going to put the tail through the loop, and that's what's going to fasten it down. So to weave in your ends, you're going to want to use something called a tapestry needle. And a tapestry needle is something that is not very sharp. It won't hurt you, but it also has a big hole in it that you can thread really thick things through. So I'm going to take this needle and I'm going to sew in and out of the seam to hide the tail so it doesn't come unraveled. So once I go in one direction, then I'm going to head back in the other direction. And it can be kind of tricky to pull through because the yarn is so thick, but we're going to go in the other direction just to make sure it's pulled through some tight spots so it doesn't want to unravel. And then we can snip our yarn off and do the same thing on the tail that's from the very beginning of our cowl. So once you've woven in your ends, you can turn your cowl right side out like this, and then give it a few squishes to see how soft and cozy it is, and hopefully it's cold enough where you live where you can try it on right away and run outside and play in some snow. Now that you know how to finger knit, I have a whole blanket pattern that you can make using the same off the hook yarn from Lion Brand. You can find the free pattern and a video tutorial just like this on my blog, which is called makeanddocrew.com. I'll also put the link to it right below this video. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. If you had fun with this tutorial, I'd love it if you gave it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, happy finger knitting!